you everyone for coming. And please let me know, for those of you who are on Zoom, firstly, thank you for your patience, but also if you are on Zoom, just use the chat function to let us know if you're not hearing things properly, if you're not seeing things properly. I want to begin this session. It just says that I'm muted, but I'm sure that I am not. I believe that I'm heard. I would like to begin this session just by acknowledging that I'm standing and working on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're very lucky today to have a panel that has pre-recorded their talks, but they're also going to be available for a conversation at the end, as far as I'm aware. And please pipe up if there's anything you'd like to say at the very beginning. But the name of the panel is Understanding Displacement Aesthetics, Inside and Outside of Art Gallery Spaces and Systems. We have, sorry, I'm just going to change screens here. Of the speakers, oh, hi Charles. Charles has just jumped in. How are you? Oh, you're on mute. Hello, Charles. Very good to see you.
Thank you.
And we can hear you perfectly. That's great.
Perfect.
And we also have as speakers as part of our presentation, Ana Carden-Coyne, Chrisoula, Lionis, and Angeliki, Roussou. So what we're going to do, and it's a slightly odd setup, but I'm going to start to play the video. Hopefully everyone can hear and see this properly. But then Charles, we're very lucky to have you here and we can have a bit of a chat afterwards. So thank you so much for joining us. Okay, let's get this going. Share a video. Video is Chrisoula. And here we are.
Okay. Well, welcome to our panel. We are a group of researchers from the University of Manchester, and we're working on an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project, 3-year project, Understanding Displacement Aesthetics and Making Change in the Art Gallery with Refugees, Migrants and Host Communities, 2021 to 24. And there's just a link there if you're interested in our webpage. So today I am the PI on this project, and I'm going to be talking about our modes of displacement aesthetics, and Chrisoula, Lionis and Angeliki, Roussou, who are also working on this project, will also be speaking. I'm going to talk about different kinds of tropes of what we're calling displacement aesthetics over the centuries since the First World War. And we're going to be looking at displacement aesthetics in different registers. So Angeliki will be talking about co-curation largely, and Chrisoula will talk about experimental pedagogies. So without further ado, these our way of coming at displacement aesthetics is to look, we have identified 4 modalities. The first mode is what I'm going to talk about mostly today, which is a set of persistent visual tropes that are seen across diverse cultural arenas. And that might include the media, the news media, it might include magazine photojournalism, such as Magnum, Life magazine, Time magazine, Paris Match, these kinds of international magazines. The United Nations, UNRWA, the International Refugee Organization, UNESCO, UNICEF, and UNRWA, I should say as well, who also are, these big UN agencies that also engage photographers as well as artists, visual artists, in their work, humanitarian photography, charity and aid posters, and in visual art. So that could be in art that's commissioned, it could be in the art market, and can also very much include art and photo exhibitions and museums. So the tropes that we've identified so far are mobility and immobility, the crowd, the deserving refugee, the lone child, the unfit and ungrievable, and an emergent trope of materiality, the materiality of refugeedom. And it goes without saying that these tropes are gendered, are racialized, are largely dehistoricized, and often denied geographic specificity. They are displaced and often homogenized. So that's, I'm going to sort of go through a few slides with some images that typify what I'm talking about here. So the second mode of displacement aesthetics refers to the political systems, the international refugee regimes, the United Nations conventions and humanitarian policies that fundamentally underpin the role of representations of suffering and attempts to humanize and also address the plight of refugees. The third mode is shaped by art institutions, including public galleries, commissioning processes, biennials, arts councils, funding regimes that shape, constitute, reproduce and disseminate displacement aesthetics, that replicate, homogenize and normalize the aestheticization of refugees, which is the main creative sphere in which the public encounter refugees. How much is this art a foil to negative media stereotypes? How humanizing is this institutional modality? And the fourth mode refers to practical aesthetics or the practical aesthetic of the humanitarian ethos or social justice agenda of museums, their accountability to government, arts policies on inclusion, on diversity, on relevance, and with communities. Their commissioning of participatory art projects that are commissioned, and what we might say, or what Lisa Malky might say, is the self-humanizing need to help. But also potentially doing harm in that need when appropriating the cultural capital of the refugee artist, or the refugee per se, to legitimize the museum, or when imposing an identity of refugee artist that provides access to resources, for example. And we have done quite a lot of interviews with artists from backgrounds of forced displacement, and that evidence will be presented by both Angeliki Roussou and Chrisoula Lionis, who are going to speak more to modes 3 and 4 in this presentation. So moving along. Mode 1 begins with thinking about mobility and immobility in terms of both biblical metaphors, such as Exodus, which obviously has a very long-standing tradition, but has been replicated in art and is a trope in art, and ecological metaphors, such as swarms, waves, floods, and flows. And everybody is familiar with Ai Weiwei's somewhat infamous film, Human Flow. But I can take this as a historian right back to the First World War, when the first newsreels of displaced people were coming out of France and out of Belgium, and also the sort of monetizing and commercialization around that with organizations like Pathé and Topical Budget, who also worked with organizations like the Red Cross and other charities to raise funds for refugees by showing their flight and their peril. And the way in which, on one hand, you have the mobility of this footage, of this newsreel footage, which to us now doesn't look very mobile, but did to people then, but also the way in which the time was slowed down by having to trek on foot in vast distances. And one of our artists that we worked in has also spoken of this slowing down of time in terms of having unfull time. It's a very useful device to think about that. And we see this replicated in art at the same time, whether it be refugees fleeing Poland in 1914, 1915. We see a lot of emphasis, of course, on the Belgian refugees. There's a huge amount of visual media, both art and photojournalistic media, and, as I said, newsreel on Belgians fleeing the German advance. Also, many of these artists were part of the official war artist scheme, or indeed the Assyrians, the refugees, the Armenians, in 1915, fleeing genocide. Fran Tratnik was a celebrated Slovenian national. He was also a witness, an artist, and his work is very famous in Slovenia. And you see these tropes again of very sort of biblical metaphors and ecological metaphors of flight against the elements. And then we can move to a similar scene in the 1940s with the Second World War, the exodus from Paris, right through to whether it's photo media, photography, painting, or even to recent Syrian refugees in Slovenia and elsewhere. These are very familiar tropes of flight and exodus and flows and cues. Another trope is the crowd, where we have the nameless numbers and masses representing crises itself, the very gathering of large numbers of people actually imaging the concept of crisis. So whether it's Frank Brangwen's Refugees Leaving Antwerp through to even Richard Moss's work with the heat maps in Maria Camp. Aid art, of course, is really interesting modality insofar as lots of artists worked for these organisations, whether it be the American Committee for Relief, Near Eastern Relief, and many other charities. You will see exactly these kinds of tropes. Conversely to mobility, of course, is immobility, stasis, the stuckness, the entrapment, the encampment, and the questioning of whether this is actually sanctuary or not. It also raises questions about what is permanent and what is temporary, what is meant to be temporary that ends up becoming permanent. And that could certainly be understood in terms of Palestinian refugees. A further iteration is the feminization of that flight. So Cynthia Enloe talks about women and children as one construct. And again, we see this is a very common trope, whether we're talking about the First or Second World Wars. And these are just further images that bring together the image of flight and specify flight as a female experience, the mother looking after her child. Edvard Saltoft is a very interesting artist insofar as he was the director of the Danish Red Cross in Russia, and so was a witness as well as working as a humanitarian, and did his own posters and drawings to raise money for Russian refugees. Again, the woman and child can also come as a carer and also a mourner or a mother of sorrows, as Picasso was very influenced by this idea of the mother of sorrows with his weeping woman with the tears scarring her face, but many other artists. Again, Frank Brangwen, these are well-known Welsh artist who then works for or produces artwork that is replicated, mass-produced in posters such as for the Spanish Relief Fund or Felicity Ashby for other forms of Spanish relief. Ursula McCannell's an interesting artist insofar as she was 13 years of age when she was trapped in Spain. And she depicted, again, these similar tropes. On the far right, down the bottom, you'll see quite an interesting poster. This is of a woman and child affected by the Blitz. But the question in the poster is, you don't know what it's like to be a refugee and to be hungry, to be homeless. Make sure this doesn't happen to you. So this image of this woman whose home's been destroyed, but not quite as bad as being a refugee, is a call for people to make their own food and to feed themselves, to be self-reliant. Tamara de Lempke is a very famous artist whose beautiful paintings of 1920s fashionable figures, girl in a green dress. She was also twice refugee, twice displaced herself. And when she, during the Russian Revolution and then during the Nazi advance in the 1940s, And then she also depicts these really harrowing pictures of refugees somewhere in Europe, 1940. But we can jump all over the place with these tropes. We can go to the Canadian Red Cross. We can go to Australian images. The Canadian Red Cross in the 60s with the Vietnam conflict, also showing these sort of images of women and child as in an abject state of hunger and desperation, and therefore deserving. These are deserving refugees. So another iteration of the deserving model, of course, is one that is demure, with downcast eyes, who is beautiful, sometimes grieving. And this is just a smattering from William Strang's Belgian peasant girl, who was actually in Manchester as a refugee, through to the Afghan girl, Steve McCurry's very famous, perhaps now even infamous, depiction of an Afghan refugee young girl. And so there's something to discuss there about beauty in the deserving. The lone child is also a very familiar trope. It's also, of course, one of the big causes of concern of the UN agencies, what we now call unaccompanied minor. And this is a trope that features in several registers, one in which the child who is devoid of family and parents could also become delinquent and vagrant. But also, on the other hand, the child is rehabilitated, the child deserves rescue, and the child is a symbol of the future of the nation. And we can see that from 1945 images of unaccompanied minors who need to be resettled in other countries and be adopted by parents, and through to the image of Ukraine, and what an image of a young girl who is the symbol of resilience in a state of play and joy, and the gendering of girls in particular as symbols of the future of the nation. Sometimes that seems to be a thread as well that we have noted. This is another trope, the unfit and the ungrievable. Of course, we're borrowing from Judith Butler's construct there, but it refers also to concepts that we use at the time in the Second World War, such as the unsuitables, the hardcore, or the word remnants that were used for displaced persons who were elderly, who were widowed, who were mad, who had significant psychological injuries, or who were too ill or too injured. And the questioning around them as whether they were unuseful, they were unworthy of protection under UN conventions, and they were non-repatriatable, and therefore objects not of sympathy, but objects of apathy. And I can see some of that thinking going right back to images of, say, Otto Dix's Der Krieg, this famous set of plates, and whether it's the Mad Woman of Saint-Marie-Api or the Mad Woman of Douai, images of women who experience extreme grief, often at the death of a child, are also considered psychological injuries that make them unsuitable for repatriation. But also we can think to the way in which images were produced for World Refugee Year in 1959, in which the problem of what to do with the Palestinians, the Chinese in Hong Kong, the White Russians, the remnants of refugees that also were arguably ungrievable. And my final slide, or second last slide, or trope, is to consider what I think is an emergent trope, the materiality of refugeedom, and that refers to objects and artifacts of flight, refugeedom as human absence, and in that human absence is also the distance from the experience, and that distance is perhaps because the artists and the photographers that have depicted these remnants, these objects and artifacts, are also themselves very distant from the experience of being forcibly displaced. And of course, I put up there Christophe Bouquel's very controversial Barca Nostra ship that was raised from the Mediterranean Sea by the Italian Navy and eventually was given to him and became the controversial exhibit at the Venice Biennale. The final iteration there is to consider this now very familiar image of boats, but there are so much photography of boats, whether it's the SS Sinai in the Second World War, whether it's Vietnamese leaving on boats, whether it's Spanish Civil War, boats leaving and boats incoming, as Richard Moss has, small boats, and concepts of the journey conjured up in the boat, and the boat that is also devoid of humans or has ghost-like humanoid figures, whether it be in Ai Weiwei's rubbery, cartoonish figures, or indeed in the way in which the human figures are becoming sort of ghost-like in the use of the heat mapping technology that Richard Moss uses, or even in the other Ai Weiwei picture there on the right-hand side, which is the bamboo straw one. They're sort of very unhuman or inhuman. So this leads just to a final questioning around these aesthetics. When and how do artists reproduce, replicate, or intervene in these aesthetics of displacement? Why can't refugee artists tell their own stories? Or if they can, how can they? Do you have to make art about refugee experience if you are or have had a background of displacement? These are questions that have come out of our interviews with the artists that we're working with on two big projects with Manchester Art Gallery and the Whitworth Art Gallery. And these are the sorts of things they want to know. You know, how do I, as an artist, break into an arts industry without the label refugee artist if it actually provides me with some resources? And are cultural institutions and non-refugee artists speaking on my behalf? Some of our artists have said. Are they appropriating what little cultural capital I have left? So there's some of the questions that I will leave you with, and we can pick this up. Angeliki will pick some of this up, and Chrisoula too, and then in our discussion we can pick that up too. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Angeliki Roussou, and I'm as Ana said, I'm part of this AHRC funded project. I'm a postdoctoral research associate for this, and I'm going to be talking to you today. So my background is in contemporary art history and theory, and today I'm going to be talking about the ethics of labor and backgrounds of displacement, and specifically in terms of transforming a public art gallery in Manchester. So I'm going to be focusing on how to frame the specificity that these backgrounds of forced displacement present when they are situated in curatorial practice within visual arts institutions in the UK, and specifically when such practice relates to issues that have to do with work and the ethics of work. So the wider area of this paper, which could be seen as one part of one of our book chapters, which hasn't really been written yet, speaks to wider pressing issues around diversity and inclusion, and is also mindful of the distinction between, on the one hand, programming, such as the themes of exhibitions, displayed artworks, or public program, and on the other hand, diversity and inclusion within deeper institutional structures and functions, such as decision-making within organizations, or hierarchies in the distribution of roles and tasks, the demographics of staff, or the right to veto creative choices, planning structures, attribution of authorship, accountability, etc. So how a curatorial program that explicitly focuses on forced displacement interrelates with all this kind of back office institutional infrastructure, and how this infrastructure then incorporates the specificities of forced displacement and how to improve all this. So this paper highlights questions of work and the ethics of collaboration in order to better navigate institutional processes that range from the initial concept of a display to the decision-making around it and all the way to the final implemented program. And I'm going to be using an example from our Understanding Displacement Aesthetics project that we worked with Manchester Art Gallery. And I'm going to be saying a little bit more about that in a bit. Okay. So, yeah, it's worth saying that this wider question around diversity and inclusion is something that is already being discussed extensively in curatorial literature and is also to an extent practiced in visual arts institutions. And in many ways, we see this through the so-called EDI policy framework, which stands for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. This framework is used not just in the visual arts sector, but also in higher education institutions and many other sectors. It aims to eradicate prejudice and discrimination on the basis of protected characteristics, such as ethnicity and gender, and it seeks to ensure fair treatment and equal opportunity for all in the way we work and collaborate within institutions. So that's one part that we are particularly interested in. However, as many scholars have suggested, there is a disjuncture between, on the one hand, the aimed policies, and on the other, the actual conditions in those institutions. And it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of bibliography around these institutions being typically very elitist, or at least accessible primarily to educated middle classes. Authors such as Pierre Bourdieu and Tony Bennett have written extensively on this, and those audiences in turn have been historically more white and male, at least in economies of the global north, such as the UK. So this juncture can take multiple forms between the actual and the aimed policies, but I'd like to focus here on what happens when forced displacement is employed as a curatorial theme or a methodological angle from which to interpret something already existing. So in both cases, the most obvious question that arises is whether whatever is being narrated becomes the voice of subjects that identify with this background. And within this question, there are important debates around the host and hostee dynamic, and some of that was already mentioned by Ana previously. Where for many reasons we end up with art about forced displacement that is made by well-meaning artists who don't have that lived experience. So I don't want to stay too much on these issues and debates, but I just want to say here that it is just to highlight the importance of actually including the voice of artists from these backgrounds and their work. So, and when I say work, I mean creative or administrative or curatorial into the visual arts sector. And this inclusion should be taking place consciously beyond just the use of displacement as a theme. So I want to stress that this actual inclusion should also be about increasing their actual agency in the sector. So this is a question about agency. And this is where it becomes clear that institutional hierarchy and access should relate closely to questions of work, and specifically curatorial work, if we conceive it as forms of participation that might somehow influence the program in visual arts institutions. So to kind of give an example of, a specific example of one of these complex questions. At Manchester Art Gallery, which is a major public art gallery in Manchester, we have been sort of trying to rethink and reframe a section of its collections display that specifically focuses on the Grand Tour. And the Grand Tour refers to artworks and motifs of mastery that emerged from established forms of travel and cultural tourism of the 18th and 19th century, through which many Western European artists attempted to take inspiration from classical antiquity and its geographical and cultural legacy. So at Manchester Art Gallery, the purpose of this project has been a kind of decolonial, it has been a decolonial attempt, really. On one hand, it involves the gallery acknowledging its own involvement in reproducing the canonical art historical tropes of the Grand Tour, and its association with institutional prestige by acquiring most of these works in the decades after World War II, so relatively recently, in order to display connoisseurship and elevate the collection's prestige. So one is the acknowledgement of this reproduction of the institutional prestige through those acquirements, those acquisitions. And on the other hand, there is a reversal of narratives that exposes the privileged, appropriative, and colonial aspects of the Grand Tour precisely by juxtaposing the perspective of forced displacement and the focus on the inhumane, confining, and incriminating global conditions of travel, mobility, and immobility of today. And the Rethinking the Grand Tour project has not only aimed at signaling a permanent gallery change through this narrative reversal, but it has also been a thoroughly collaborative process aiming at increased agency and authorship for artists from backgrounds of forced displacement, and an impactful and long-lasting, and to be an impactful and long-lasting intervention that goes beyond the usual short-lived gallery inclusion of diverse voices. And this has been the aim, and we have sort of tried to move to that direction. But before I say a little bit more about how this took place curatorially and the challenges around labeling and framing this kind of background and this lived experience, I'd like to elaborate on this short-lived inclusion, which is often experienced as box ticking and can affect people's artistic practice and well-being. So artists who we've interviewed for the purposes of the wider research project have felt that their inclusion in training programs or opportunities offered by art institutions have been a box-ticking exercise on behalf of these institutions. And these are opportunities for minority ethnic artists, for instance, as they hardly ever lead to sustained and long-lasting collaborations or a sense of sort of ongoing inclusion. And the same artists from our interviews have felt a lack of long-term institutional commitment, and a lack of collaboration whose benefits outlives the duration of the collaboration, suggest a lack of respect, actually, and an acknowledgement on behalf of institutions, even if those institutions are working towards inclusion and are well-meaning. So referring to neo-colonial forms of governance in visual arts institutions, art theorist Andrea Phillips has discerned complex processes of correction through a meritocratic inclusion. So the paternalistic or even violent protectionism that she observes as supposedly justified by objective and universal scales of merit not only presents exclusion as a problem of the past rather than the present, but also coerces the included subjects into accepting this formerness as well. So extrapolating this argument to backgrounds of forced displacement, we can confirm that forcibly displaced artists are made to feel pressured into constantly performing their identity if they want to be included to the allocated spaces and initiatives for diversity, while at the same time they have to accept that meritocracy has now fully replaced any structural exclusions. Acknowledging the artist's own agency in terms of how they want to be referred to, as has in our project, has been a topic of extensive discussion, as the participating artists unanimously concluded that they don't want to be described as forcibly displaced or migrant artists, with some of them also opposing any references to migration or forced displacement whatsoever in supplementary texts, despite the project being directly informed by those lived experiences. So apart from all the triggering and the sort of triggered responses that can take place, and the desire to disassociate from such identifying labels due to all the hostility that is going on in the UK at the moment. Those artists seek to strategically disengage from the amateurish or unaccomplished connotations that often accompany artists whose identity needs mentioning to justify their inclusion in the aforementioned box-ticking terms. And this is just a small example of the ways in which curatorial categorizing and labeling can be manipulated by participating artists who should really be understood as experts and collaborators and creative decision makers, as their own agency needs to be prioritized against the institution's need to tick its diversity and inclusion boxes. And this also reflects historian and theorist of race, Paul Gilroy, who argued that the discursive and institutional shift from racial difference to diversity and plurality facilitates audience segmentation and privatizes dissent. So in other words, when projects around diverse communities become a genre for art institutions to browse through and select, it is possible that particular struggles end up altered and more insulated and less able to identify possible common ground with other struggles. So it becomes clear why artists might try to circumvent this genre of diversity, at least in terms of the public profiling of their projects. So some further thoughts to conclude. I have so far tried to give a glimpse of the complex challenges that arise with inclusion of backgrounds of forced displacement in the UK visual arts sector. Despite the existing EDI policies, as well as collaborative projects that specifically address those backgrounds. So often well-meaning institutional intentions to appear inclusive can end up being perceived as disrespectful by artists who feel trapped in specific categories where they don't have any agency over. So if an institution wants to be properly inclusive, it might mean that it needs to be strategic about how it publicly displays its inclusivity. And in some cases, it might mean that it needs to quiet down these attempts to include. But we are in the process of interviewing our collaborators for the book around different aspects of their professional experience and their involvement with this project, and some other projects that we haven't really referred to yet in this panel. But my initial argument at this stage would be that, which I also hope to develop in relation to specific employment barriers for asylum seekers who don't have a refugee status yet, is that we need to understand and frame any creative participation or intellectual advising as work, and indeed as work of expertise, if we want more accountability from art institutions and their policies, as well as increased agency for these artists of these backgrounds. So yeah, happy to take further questions later. Thanks very much. Thank you.
So hi everybody, I am Chrisoula Lionis. I'm the third speaker in today's panel. I'm a cultural producer, I write about contemporary art, and today I am going to be speaking to you about something I'm describing as displaced pedagogies, experimental networks, funding models, and professional development. The things I'll be talking to you about today logically follow on from Angeliki's paper, in that I'm considering the relationship between pedagogy and precisely that agency that Angeliki was talking about for artists with backgrounds of forced displacement and their involvement in the visual arts industry. So I'm just going to jump right ahead because I'm conscious of time, and say that over the last 30 years, that is in the time since doctoral degrees in the visual arts began to be awarded in the 1990s, the relationship between visual art, educational institutions, research projects, and funding have become increasingly entwined. One measure of this is that specialist masters and doctoral programs in visual arts and curatorship continue to grow in number around the world every year. This has caused many to ask whether universities are simply using art as a lackey to push real-world impact, or whether art schools are merging with universities in order to survive by widening their market and accessing public funds. Running parallel to this change, there has been a phenomenal growth in artist residencies internationally, bleeding out beyond arts contexts to be in business, technology, science, and education. Even Facebook has an artist in residence. These residencies are crucial to arts training, to building networks, and to establishing international profiles. What I mean to demonstrate in painting a brief picture of these major changes in arts training is to say that to become a professional artist today frequently relies heavily on a connection to the university and to arts residencies. Yet, there are many artists that face profound challenges in terms of taking part in this training circuit, in particular artists with backgrounds of forced displacement. In this short paper, I seek to demonstrate how this art pedagogical landscapes impacts upon these artists, in particular those who have gone through the asylum process as adults and whose unique experience of contemporary art industries and training remains under-researched. This paper is focused on the UK context. Sorry. Just had a bit of a technical glitch that we're going to try to sort out. And I'm hoping that that is now working. Okay, so to continue where I left off, this paper is focused on the UK context and research produced as part of the Understanding Displacement Aesthetics, or DAP project, running out of the University of Manchester. DAP seeks to amplify the voices of refugee and migrant artists and curators, and to challenge what we define as displacement aesthetics. That is the aesthetics and the modalities that Anna described in her paper, through research activities centered on collaboration with creative practitioners with backgrounds of forced displacement residing in Manchester. Through these activities that we consider both practice-led research and impact actions, we have been able to identify some of the key challenges faced by artists with backgrounds of displacement. These include the loss of time, waiting for refugee status, restricted travel, mastery over language, access to funding, and social and economic precarity. The challenge I want to address today, however, is that of training and education. I will focus on two case studies of pedagogical programs we have engaged as part of the Understanding Displacement Aesthetic project. The In Place of War Creative and Social Entrepreneur Program, or CASE, and the Artists for Artists, or AFA Masterclass Program. Framed by a focus on how these programs operate both inside and outside formal institutional structures, this paper will map the strengths and weaknesses of these projects. It will consider how these programs cater to specific challenges faced by forcibly displaced artists, and it will offer some recommendations for future contemporary art training. We know that the key challenges faced by artists from backgrounds of forced displacement are compounded by existing long-standing inequalities within the cultural sector. In the UK, for example, the arts are not diverse in terms of ethnicity, because there are particularly low numbers of Black and minority ethnic workers across all art sectors. These inequalities have been analysed at length by scholars working in the fields of cultural policy, who argue that the arts and cultural industries in the UK are strongly stratified by ethnicity, age, and class. And having worked in Australia, I can say that it is a very similar situation there. Art training is part of this problem. For example, one study led by Mark Banks and Kate Oakley analysed changes in UK art schools over the last 5 decades and found that there has been a steady increase in the, and I quote them here, colonisation of middle-class applicants of various creative industry jobs, all the way from volunteer positions to the small number of prestigious continuing appointments. Importantly, their point is that this problem has become more pronounced as the number of people with tertiary qualifications has increased, mirroring the exceptional growth of the creative economy, within which art schools are well-known incubators for these creative industries. What this means is that while there is a prevailing sense that both universities and the creative industries in the UK are some of the best in the world, access to them is marked by pre-existing privilege, for there is clear evidence that the majority of creative industry jobs are awarded to graduates from elite universities. All of this impacts upon artists from backgrounds of forced displacement acutely, who have already faced significant interruptions to their careers and their educations. The impact of these higher education policies was discussed with us at length by an artist we work with in Manchester. She fled Iran as a result of her student activism, and her qualifications were not recognised within the British higher education system. Classed as an international student, she was ineligible for a student loan, and the cost of higher education was impossible, particularly while she was living on the asylum support cash allowance. For her, the failure to recognise her qualifications meant that she took up whatever education and training opportunities were provided to her. These opportunities were in large part connected to the community, not-for-profit arts sector. And this is a quote from her that you can see on the PowerPoint. What this means is that while this artist did find access to free arts training, she was not afforded the agency to decide on the type of training that would build on her existing expertise or professional interests. Importantly, access to specialised and targeted higher education is not just about developing creative or professional practice. It is key to the establishment of professional networks. As an artist originally from the Kurdistan region of Iraq explains, we are using the higher education system. We put ourselves in the institutions to have these connections, to know more people, because it's a bit easier for you to know a few people. Access to networks through art schools is vital to initiating contact with peers outside and beyond the community arts sector. This means contact with mid-career and established artists who teach in UK institutions, as well as being part of a network of peers who become powerfully bonded together in each course intake. Now, despite my very limited presentation of DAP interview research data here, I want to make the simple point that when we consider the experience of even these two artists together, a few things become very clear. The first is a lack of agency over the kinds of training and educational opportunities open to artists with backgrounds of forced displacement. The second is the challenge of tapping into art networks. So it's here I want to discuss CASE and AFA as pedagogical programs focused on these challenges, and programs that might, each in their own, perhaps small way, offer an intervention into these problems. So to begin with IPAL. In 2021, our research team collaborated with the NGO In Place of War to deliver their creative and social entrepreneur training program in Manchester. I know I've got an assault of text in the background with a lot of information about IPAL, but I don't have time to talk about it and thought I'd put it up there for anyone that might be interested. Whilst today IPAL is an NGO, its origins stem from a University of Manchester-led research project exploring the performing arts in conflict zones. Today, they work across much of the global south, working with grassroots arts organisations to train, chronicle, and fund community arts projects. Our collaboration with IPAL, however, marked the first time that their CASE program was held in the UK, delivered this time to artists with backgrounds of forced displacement. Conducted over 6 weeks, artists were trained in various social enterprise methods, becoming familiar with case studies of creative entrepreneurship from the global south. As part of CASE, artists received a certificate of attendance from the University of Manchester, as well as seed funding to develop their creative projects. The participating artists in Manchester reported to us that they found the program useful because it provided both alternative models of creative enterprise they could use in the UK context, and because they found mentorship and advice on UK arts funding particularly useful. This included information about UK business models and community financing, as well as arts grants. Whilst the program was not without its challenges, it did succeed in providing essential industry training. It was able to do this in the UK in large part because it operated both inside and outside art educational institutions. That is to say, institutions, in this case, the University of Manchester and the Whitworth Art Gallery and the Manchester Art Gallery, that provided the space and funding for the program, something that IPAL, now as an NGO, relies upon. In this way, IPAL is the kind of pedagogical model I describe in my work with the term institutional parasite. Another such institutional parasite is Artists for Artists, a pedagogical platform I co-founded with artist Stefanos Sivopoulos in 2020, and one that the DAP project worked with in March 2022. Where the CASE program targeted artists from various stages of their career with diverse creative practices, Artists for Artists focuses very much on the visual arts and early career artists who have received formal artistic training and who have an established, growing artistic professional profile. Developed in the first wave of the COVID pandemic, the premise of AFA is relatively simple. Connect internationally leading artists with early career artists from around the world for intensive mentorships and small-scale workshops online. The unique model concentrates on early career artists with a focus on the Global South, and over 60 artists from more than 35 countries have participated and discussed their projects, ideas, and practice in our biannual editions. Our last edition, Language is Never on the Ground, was supported and developed in collaboration with the DAP project. It focused on contemporary art and the experience of displacement, and engaged artistic practice that examined themes including language as impediment, sound and displacement, voice as survival, and acoustics as somatic memory. Workshops in this edition were led by artists Radio Alhara, Katerina Zdjela, Lydia Urahman, and Hiva Kah. Whilst we developed AFA to afford opportunities for mentorship, funding, and network building for artists in the Global South, that is, those who often face restrictions on travel in terms of visas and have limited access to the networks, funds, and spaces connected to major art training institutions and residence spaces in the Global North. What we found through our last edition is that the program has particular pertinence for artists with backgrounds of displacement. For example, one of the Manchester artists that we work with in DAP took part in the AFA program and reported that the tailored mentorship she received there was more than what was provided to her through her PhD supervision. No doubt this was because she was in the company of international peers who both understood her practice and provided tailored feedback and support. Whilst AFA is arguably part of a larger sweep of online training activity, including, for example, the Alternative Arts School run by artist Nato Thompson, a fundamental difference between it and other programs is that AFA is not looking to monetize education. It relies instead on a combination of volunteer labor, solidarity between artists, philanthropy, and where possible, forms of institutional support. Whilst this lends independence and agility, it puts AFA, like so many artist-run spaces and initiatives, under the constant spectre of working with no money. It also means, this means relying on friendship and professional networks. It also means being an institutional parasite who works in, out, between institutional spaces, sharing resources when mutually beneficial. So this bit, I want to move to thinking about recommendations for the future. And I'm just skipping through some slides here. At its best, this insider-outsider position can open up access to new networks, legal protections through laws around academic freedom, and alternative pathways to funding. It also operates as a kind of brokerage, connecting people, networks, and resources. This conference is a measure of this too. That is because the structure of Hunar and the approach of many of its members also reflect this institutional insider-outsider approach to art making, research, and pedagogy, centered both on the representation, but also the lived reality of art making in contexts of crisis. My final point, considering IPAL's case program, AFA, and indeed Hunar, is that we are at a moment when we can really harness research creation and institutional resources as a means of producing more experimental, agile, and indeed equitable forms of art training. Supporting the professional needs of artists with backgrounds of displacement is one part of building more equitable forms of artistic pedagogy. My suggestion is that we focus our attention on strengthening alternative forms of access to higher education spaces and resources. One that, for example, acknowledges professional experience and prior qualifications as a pathway for artists to access postgraduate degrees, as an example. We must also work with a greater focus on mentorship, and we should develop strategies that enable specialized network building and experimental approaches to arts funding, including, for example, peer-to-peer funding. If we champion these experimental, artistically driven methods of pedagogy and research, the hope is that we can be more responsive to issues of social justice and that we can render the daily lives of artists to be more sustainable. Thank you.
Before you pause, we'd just like to say thank you to everybody.
Yes.
And also that we will be waking up very early in the morning at about 5 o'clock or something. We will be taking questions, the three of us, and also we're going to be joined by our international partner on this project, who is Professor Charles Green, also an artist, and he will be phoning in, or whatever the term is, from Melbourne University, and he will chair our panel. So we look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a limited amount of time before we will stop. And I've got some thoughts as a respondent to each of those papers and to the project. But first of all, because we really haven't got a huge amount of time, I'd welcome any questions from you first to our speakers before I talk. And if I don't get to talk, that's absolutely fine. But you could raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask a question, or use the chat function. So let's go that way first before I ask the speakers some questions. We'll probably not get through that much, but let's try. So if you've got something that you want to say, unmute yourself or type your question into the chat function. While we wait for that, one of the things that comes up for me listening to you all is that this has been a journey, and I'm interested in your reflections on your own roles and how they've actually changed in the process of the couple of years of working on this project, and how you think you can avoid reification of your own roles, because that's something that in a very 1970s way, each of you is proposing something that used to be called by theorists like the Brazilian Paulo Freire, praxis. So you're all seeking praxis, but how you've clearly had to go on a journey with your roles as scholars, as academics, as interrogators. And that involves a whole set of double binds. And I'm interested in that for a start. And the second reflection that immediately arose to me is how identical, but not absolutely identical, the process that you've been involved with is with others' processes of attempting to decolonise the art museum. I'm thinking about Australia, and I'm thinking about the UK as well. Now, this is not identical to that, or it is. So I'm interested in what differences or what extra emphases you see emerging. So I'm not seeing any questions yet from the audience, but I throw that to you. And I have, if we have space, I have precise questions to address to each of you. Anna or Chrisoula or Angeliki.
Can you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, sorry, I'm kind of slightly whispering because there's a really small child asleep upstairs.
So we'll sing lullabies.
Look, just going back on something Chrisoula was saying about this insider-outsider status, now that you've asked this question, Charles, I sort of think we also have tried to sort of be insiders and outsiders as both, perhaps, I mean, I'm just a historian, but I think some of our work has involved participant observation, has involved making friendships and bonds with the artists that we've worked with, precisely because we're also brokering relationships with the art institution. So we're kind of in the middle. We're also having separate meetings with our art institutions, and that's been incredibly complicated in terms of, say, the grand tour rethink that Angeliki was talking about. That has been an epic journey of 2 years of negotiation just to change one wall, because it's a permanent change. So there's also that complexity of doing something permanent in an institution versus doing exhibitions. So we're also doing an exhibition with the Whitworth, and that has been a much smoother process. And that's something about the temporariness of an exhibition versus something more substantial, permanent in a gallery that's significantly changing it for, the foreseeable future. So I don't want to occupy all the space here, because I'd like Chrisoula and Angeliki to reflect as the other members of the team. I think also with my role as PI in the British concept, that means Principle Investigator rather than the AHRC version of partner, I think. I've also got the financial oversight, so that also puts me in a more sort of authoritative position. So I'm kind of in a bit of a triangulated as well as an insider-outsider. But I think anybody who does these sorts of really big, complex, this is £1 million project. It's a very significant amount of arts funding. I'm very, very conscious that this is taxpayers, it's public money. And so the ethics of how we conduct ourselves is fundamentally part of our journey too. Chrisoula, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I've got like 50 billion things to say, and I'm very excited to also look in the audience and see some familiar faces. And I'm sorry that I missed so much because of our time difference. And I know you're wrapping up for the day, and I know we don't have much time. Charles, they're really excellent questions, and I thought I would tackle the really big one before I just mention something briefly about positionality. The really big question about decolonizing the museum and where we connect to this kind of decolonial activity, it became very apparent to us, particularly through the Whitworth project. So we're doing a project where we're basically mining the collection of a museum to look for objects, and we're working with a community focus group with backgrounds of forced displacement, and we're going through, just to summarize, we're going through the collection to look for collection items that resonate with them. Now, what's been very interesting is to see how many stories, histories, people, surprise, surprise, are omitted from the narration in the collection. So the stories behind particular objects just aren't there in the notes around collections objects. And what we've found is that, wow, the process that we're going through is remarkably similar to decolonial projects that are going through museum collections and archives. But of course, that should not be surprising, because how can you talk about displacement if you're not talking about coloniality? Those things are intrinsically linked. So there's that, just to answer really quickly. The question of positionality has been so much part of this. I knew it when we started the project, and I was kind of harping on about we have to be honest about our positionality from the beginning. But it's become more and more complicated, because what I didn't anticipate were ethics questions around, for example, institutional partners and seeing challenges within institutions and how to write about them. Of course, working with community collaborators and the ethics of what you say and what you don't say. And then for me, doing projects that are outside this research project that intersect at times and then also operate outside the institution. So that's also been quite a journey. So yeah, the positionality question increasingly is an important one, and I think one that will be inflecting the research outputs more and more.
Angeliki.
Yeah, hi, Charles and everyone. Good morning. For us. I don't think I've got much to add here. I joined this project in April, and I think I'm now at a place where I can sort of probably give a paper over one of the curatorial projects that we're working with, which was the one with Manchester Art Gallery, where, as Anna and Chrisoula said, there's a lot of there have been a lot of changes with the scope of what we were doing and the practicalities and all that, and the, I don't know, financial, their own program. But yeah, it's been really fascinating for me to really see how all these practicalities that have been emerging to sort of think forward and think through how this will be narrated in a monograph. And it has been also really interesting to prepare for that through the ethics process that the university kind of has set up for these kinds of types of research, because we will have to interview all our collaborators, so that the different just the different stages in which through which we get ethics clearance for these interviews will then sort of feed into what we're going to produce as a kind of research output. So for me, yeah, it's been like a really interesting process to observe and learn that.
And I just would add one thing. The title of our project is Making Change. And so it's understanding displacement aesthetics. So we're identifying what this concept is and what its reaches are. And then it's making change in the art gallery with refugees, migrants, and this dreadful term host communities. So we had this partnership agreements with the institutions, and they're also committing their own in-kind funding and support and staffing and all of that stuff. But it turns out that, and they want to make change. They want to make institutional changes about how their database works, what kinds of keywords you can use to search, but also how they work as teams, and how they hire people, how their organisation, the processes of collaboration, how they work. So we've been sort of brought in to help them. It turns out that's a decolonising method, very, very hard to do. And in fact, no one's really clear on how one does change an institution. So it's turned out through our projects that we've come across a lot of walls, dare I say a yellow wall. That's one of the walls we're having painted. But yeah, it turns out decolonising looks good on paper. It's a very great thing to write about, but actually making people do it as a practice is very, very hard.
We're actually out of time. What that means for us is this has been a really useful catch up for us as the team participants, but also I think we're all of us, the four of us, quite amazed at the ambitiousness of this conference. I mean, it's astonishing as we look at the program, just the ambition with which you guys have approached this. And I think we're a bit in awe of you guys putting this together, and we thank you for doing that. I mean, I know the usual rhetoric and etiquette of these seminars is for you to thank the speakers, but I think us as a team, we think we'd like to thank you for putting this event on. I think it's remarkable, and I think each of us, despite our bleariness or our hyper-caffeinatedness, we thank you for putting this on. It's remarkable. Thank you, Hunar. Thank you, UTS. And
could I also suggest that if because we had such little time for conversation, if anyone has any feedback for us, that they get in contact with us with, I think our email addresses are provided. We'd be really, really delighted to receive any suggestions, any feedback.
And I'll go along there are so many thematic crossovers, both with Australia as a nation and the UK as a nation, but also the experience, for example, that I've had trying to get remote community Indigenous people enrolled in PhD programs is so similar to the obstacles that we've faced here in the DAP project. In other words, universities, despite the rhetoric, the refusal to recognise prior experience, the refusal to be flexible in delivery and in enrolment procedures, despite well-meaning rhetoric that's often quite sincere, we come up with these obstacles in so many dimensions, despite universities' rhetorics. I don't even think it's hypocrisy. I think it's the walls that Anna just talked about. We're over time. I thank you at UTS and Hunar. It's remarkable. And of course, I thank each of my three co-project participants for your incredible generosity in waking up so early in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, will you now go into a
Thank
final session? Timothy, over to you.
Sorry, I'm just running around from different parts of the room. But thank you so much for our presenters. That was just such a wonderful presentation. I felt like cheering at many moments of all of the talks. I'm sure we all had the same feeling. And of course, thank you especially for our speakers who got up very early in the morning so that you could be here to be present with us. That's so wonderful. It's so meaningful to the Hunar community. And thank you for chairing as well, Charles. That was absolutely wonderful. Excellent. Well, as mentioned by, please do keep in touch with everyone if you want to email with any questions. And thank you to everyone in the room and everyone on Zoom for attending as well.